All right, guys, welcome back to the Progressive Rehab and Strength Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Rory Alter, head clinical coach here at Progressive Rehab and Strength, with the lovely Dr. Alyssa Havison, who is also a clinical coach here at Progressive Rehab and Strength. And if you've been tuning into the last couple episodes on the podcast, you now know that Alyssa is our competitive handling specialist or our competitive powerlifting specialist coach. Like, if this is how I always like
you like to come up with a new
like
title every time we do something.
If you go back to and listen to our first 100 episodes on the podcast, you'll know that when I talk about Alyssa, there's 8 million different ways to describe Alyssa because she's just that awesome. So, anyway, Alyssa works with majority competitive powerlifters, a lot of them at a high level. And as do I, but in my mom season, I've been working with more of the general lifting athlete. I do have a lot of my competitive athletes who have just been with me for a long time, but Alyssa takes on the majority of the competitive lifters at present here at Progressive Rehab and Strength for a very good reason. She has a very strong background in competition herself. She's a ref, international ref. And yeah, so what we're going to talk about today is the inevitable, but very often avoidable process of being injured leading into a competition or getting injured within a competition. And there's always going to be this decision that you have to make. Do I go forward with the competition or do I sit the competition out? And that can be, do I go forward with literally finishing the competition? Or do I go forward with training into this competition and going to the competition despite the injury that I'm dealing with? Because as a reminder, we can have pain, we can be injured, and we can still lift. But there's always going to be a risk reward. And we have to look at everything surrounding that competition and that injury and weigh everything and make a decision based on all the pieces of the puzzle. And so what we're going to talk about today is, again, training into a competition with an injury, or should you not, and continuing with the competition if you get injured within a competition, or should you not. So before we kind of dive into that, I want to bring up two examples of this where we made the decision for one of my athletes, and this is recently. She competed at the Pan Am competition in Costa Rica. So my client Steph has been dealing with a shoulder injury, and it was actually we kind of been working around it for a year almost, because she went to bench nationals to try and qualify for worlds. Didn't qualify for worlds, but got called for Pan Am. And that was a goal of hers, to go to an international competition. So she said, I'm dealing with this shoulder injury, but I kind of been dealing with it. It's not super bad. It's just nagging and annoying. We were working around it, not making it worse. And then we went through with the competition. She actually won the competition without hitting a PR. If you go back to our last episode on strategy, that was a very strategic competition for her in how she won without hitting a PR, but she wanted to win. The goal was to win, not to hit a PR, go to an international competition and win. And because that's what you want to do when you go to those things. And then she came back from the competition and she's actually dealing with a new injury that resulted from peaking with an injury. So, and these are things we were well aware of together as athlete, coach, physical therapist. These are things we were all well aware of, very open about, through the whole process and made strategic decisions to get to where we are today, having won an international competition, but now we're kind of dealing with the aftermath. Um, and she had a lot riding on that. She invested in the one, she really wanted to go to an international competition. Two, she invested money in going, purchasing her plane
Mhm.
ticket, her hotel, the team tracksuit, like all these things. She has to pay for the competition, which
And
is
where was it this
Costa
year?
Rica.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
I don't know if it's
not
expensive to get.
local.
Not local. um
Not in the
so
US.
she went and she did great, goal accomplished and mission accomplished, and come back and we're dealing with some other things now. But now we're taking that step back and dealing. Um, so we weighed those things leading into it, and it was very open and aware of what was going on. The other example is more of an acute scenario, which is my own example. I don't actually think that I've ever had. Oh, I have one. I won't bring this one up, but um, out of protection for that lifter. But um, the that was the only other scenario that I can think of where a client got hurt in a competition. But I my own injury at the Arnold, I think it was 2018, 2019. I can't remember.
I don't know.
Um, what?
I don't know.
I don't remember. I haven't we have a whole episode on this, and we also have an article on this. I fractured my hip in competition. I fractured it on the bench press. We don't have to get into the specifics of that. It was a very aggressive leg drive and a very, very late start command. Um, anyway, fractured my hip, excruciating pain, took some deep breaths, finished out the competition, hit a deadlift PR after fracturing my hip. And then later that day, also competed in the bench pro competition, or pro bench competition, whatever it was called, at the Arnold as well. So, dealt with an injury, regrouped mid competition with my coach and my husband, made the decision to finish the competition and do a second competition in the same day. Dealt with the ramification. I wouldn't even say ramifications. I would have been dealing with the rehab from that after. So nothing I did made it worse.
Yeah.
So do you have any examples before we dive into the the conversation of client, like, scenarios where this has happened?
As far as clients go, I think the examples that I have are more clients who have a history of symptoms. What
Mhm.
we tend to see is when we're peaking, when training
Yes.
stress is high, that's when people are always like,
My
well,
back is hurting.
now it's bugging me. Well, yeah, because training stress is high, recovery is not what it was months ago when training stress was low because we have this accumulated. It's not that recovery
Stress.
isn't what we just can't recover as much from the higher stress. So that's when we do tend to see things kind of show themselves and remind you that they're there. But it's about managing them at that point and being able to still perform, still train, going
Mhm.
into the meet. And usually in those instances, what I find like every time is that even if something's nagging them leading into the meet, all of a sudden they're fine on meet day. Um, with those kinds of symptoms. But and I do personally have things that have popped up leading into meets, like hip issues, more like so like apophysitis of really, it was
Mhm.
similar. It
Yeah.
wasn't the avulsion fracture that you had, but but my body wanted to do that. That's really where
Right,
where
yeah.
I was having that. And that stuck with me through a couple meets, one right after the next because it was worlds and then nationals a few weeks later when that was the schedule. And I just remember going to nationals thinking I cannot wait until this is over.
Mhm.
Um, and and then when it was over, I took some months off to deal with it. And that's something that over the years kind of popped up and showed itself. But hasn't been a thing for a while. But yeah, it's usually when training stress is high, and that's also the time when I highly recommend not trying anything new. Um,
Yeah, I mean, so that's kind of the first thing that we should talk about is like why. I mean, I think if we see injuries, um, at least for us, the way that we program, the sustainable training method that we use, and we have episodes. I'll link our episodes on the sustainable training method um in the show notes. But with our sustainable training method, we don't see a lot of injuries throughout general training.
mhm,
But we might see, aches and pains pop up, or old nagging injuries that people might have come to us for pop up surrounding competition.
mhm,
And we'll see that, in other lifters who have, other training methods that they use. And people tend to get aches and pains show up, or nagging injuries or old injuries or new injuries leading into, during, and after competition, because the training stress is much higher than it generally is in a building phase relative to peaking for competition. So, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
yeah, and I did just also want to add, not just the training stress. There's also like the emotional
Right.
stress associated with it, because that is sometimes when I'll have clients unrelated to competition, or all of a sudden something that's, they have a history of having nagging symptoms in a certain area will come up, and I'm like, well, what else is going on? Oh, well, by the way, actually I had this major stressor in my personal life. So I do also think, on top of the training stress, as you get close to a meet, there is also this emotional stress associated with it that doesn't help. Because that all takes a toll. So really, as we're getting close to a meet, the intensity is higher, um, and we always want to be able to recover from the training that we do, but we do start to accumulate more of that training stress when the intensity is higher, and we have to obviously make adjustments to account for that, so that we're not running ourselves into the ground leading into a meet. um, but when fatigue is higher, when training stress is higher, when we might be accumulating some stress that's carrying over, um, that's when, like you said, we're going to be more susceptible. And then sometimes, and I always urge people not to try new things. I always say this, like, not to try new things. Sometimes when I have someone who's like, "Hey,
Don't don't
we're
go ice skating if you've never been
we're
ice skating before.
we're a month out from a meet, and you want to start adding in some like at home yoga." I'm like, even that, let's just wait. This is not, out of all of the time in the last 12 months, this is definitely not it. Um, let's just wait like a little bit. And also, immediately after a meet is not a great time to
Yeah.
do something new. I have a lifter, they'll know who they are if they're listening to this, who went hiking after a meet not too long ago. And we paid for that a little bit, with some symptoms that popped up. And everything is fine now. But I said, well, that probably wasn't the time to
It's
go
kind of like
hiking.
it's kind of like when, someone gets shingles, it's usually after something like really stressful, you
Hmm.
know, or after a period of high stress in your life, you might end up with a cold, you know? It's because your body, the mental stress and the physical stress of a competition um takes a lot out of you. Um so and you're just like working harder to prepare for competition. Things are much more specific. They're higher intensity. Um, they might be more frequent um, than they were previously. And then all of a sudden, you build all of this, you accumulate fatigue basically, in order to then super compensate after a period of de-stressing or deloading for a brief period of time, and then you show that you've made progress on your lifts. So, um and you might even like find that you fail the things that you might end up hitting in competition because you're really overtraining leading into the competition.
Mhm.
And like I myself and my lifters sometimes like miss deadlifts that we know we can lift leading into competition and then hit PRs, you know? So your body is just working very, very hard leading into that competition. And all of a sudden it's just like, maybe this is a little too much.
Yeah, and I would say generally speaking, these are usually like almost all of the time more nagging symptoms, not major acute injuries. Now,
hmm
obviously, your example for age doesn't fit
Well, I
for that.
think, yeah. So I think it's these nagging issues are the things that we can see leading up to and after a
Hmm.
competition. But in a competition, those are going to be like more cute things that happen. Maybe you like missed a lift and it hurt you, or got a very delayed start command and fractured your hip. But there are also things that, unless it's like they put the wrong weight on one side of the bar, like misloaded the bar, and that, the unevenness of the bar hurt you, or I'm trying to think of like some weird thing that could like physically hurt
If the
you.
spotters didn't catch a
Right.
bar, like
Yeah.
there usually is some type of hint that we might be seeing something else later on.
Right.
I feel like it usually doesn't come out of
Right.
nowhere. Um, but if we
Oh, and
manage things,
there were like
yeah,
definitely warning signs for my hip before it happened. And I was just like, oh, it's my stupid hip, and kept
yeah,
training,
yeah.
you
And then your
know.
stupid hip was like, oh,
But then it was like, maybe if the judge gave me the start command like 10 seconds sooner, maybe, who knows. But okay. So let's say we have an injury that pops up somewhere in the 4-week mark leading into competition. How do we decide to move forward with the competition or pull out of the competition?
well, we've got to. So we've been talking a lot about risk versus reward. Um, you know, and it's a question of is it worth it? So the first thing I'm gonna ask is, what's the nature of these symptoms? Is this a situation, and regardless of how important the meat is, because sometimes we have to consider our well-being. Is this a situation where you're going to finish the meat and you're really going to pay for it and have a problem that you have to spend a significant amount of time recovering from, or potentially, you know, like and is the injury such that you even can go to the meet, or are we having some nagging symptoms that maybe are affecting things? Maybe we can scale back on volume. I mean, that's something that I've done. Okay, let's just get in some single, like, low volume, feel some weights at heavier intensities, and then get out of there, get out of the gym. Let's not push it. But we have to consider, all right, what the the financial investment of the meat, but I don't necessarily think that that is the number one concern, because
These are in no
that's
specific
yeah.
order.
Yeah, that is something that people do consider. Like, how big of a meat is it? What is the investment I've put into it? What does it mean to me? Do I am I potentially not going to be competitive at a meet where I was supposed to be competitive because I like legitimately can't bench? Am I just going to take a token bench? So could we
hmm
go and squat and deadlift, but you're benching almost nothing, or just the bar
hmm
just to get a total? And if that's the case, do you still want to go to the meet if the outcome is not going to be the outcome you originally wanted? And if that, what I just said there, is true, then is it worth going to the meet and potentially ending up more injured when the meet isn't worth it anymore? So,
Right.
or is this something that we can sort of train around? We can manage symptoms, maybe like match a PR or lift a little bit less than a PR. We're not necessarily going for a PR under these circumstances, or at least like lift something respectable for you. Um, and still have a decent day while being considerate of our bodies. Um, I would say that in general, it's not worth it to go to a meet when it's going to be a situation that you are really going to be paying for the outcome of that. And it might seem like it's a good idea beforehand, but you likely will regret it afterwards. When it's when you end up in a situation where you have an extended period of time where you have to really like reel back on the weights and training, but that's everybody has their own decision to make. I have not had anybody ever pull out of a meet because they were injured. Um, and I've never had anybody have an acute injury, like an acute injury in a meet aside from cramping, tightness. Oh, my back feels a little funky. That's usually in my opinion, related to like meet day stress. You're
Mhm.
tight,
Mhm.
and
Not
stuff
drinking
happens on
enough.
meet day. Yeah, not drinking enough. Um, but yeah, if something like that happens in a meet, then you have the decision to make, which is, do we continue with the meet? Do we continue with the meet simply to get a total and change openers and lift something light, and get out of there, or would it be wise to just leave now? It's again, there's so many things to consider. And it's
So let's talk about managing attempts when we have an injury. So let's
yeah.
say we're going into the competition, we're dealing with some sort of injury, or we get injured in the meet, and we've decided we're going to see how it goes and we're going to be conservative and we're just going to finish. How do we manage our attempts?
Yeah, so
Why am I blurry?
we always have an attempt plan. But when I'm not really sure how someone's going to feel, and I probably would say the same thing as I'm saying here if, say, a particular lift wasn't going great in training. Like, okay, well, let's just see how things are going. Let's
Right,
see how things
right.
are feeling. The opener is going to be conservative. We definitely want to make sure that we are warmed up before the cutoff for changing openers when we are not sure how someone's going to feel on meet day or if an injury is going to become a problem. We want to make sure that we leave ourselves time to lower openers if we need to. And I would say, like, generally keeping an open mind about
Mm.
attempts and really understanding that like they're not set in stone. So we might be conservative, we might take smaller jumps. It might be There might be more decision making in the moment, than really being married to a certain attempt plan. Um, and the same thing that, if you're injured during the meet, yeah, you might, if something happens during squat and bench goes fine, and then you're like, well, okay, let's see how we feel in warm ups for deadlift.
Mhm.
And again, if you know you're going into deadlift thinking that way, get warmed up early so that if you need to lower your opener, because what you don't want to do is go into deadlift feeling crappy and then you don't lower your opener. You're stuck with this opener that you fail because you tweaked your back on squat. Um, and then you the day doesn't feel like it was properly managed, I would
So
say.
remind, because we mentioned this in our last episode, but for those of you who didn't listen to our last episode, when can you change your opener?
In USA powerlifting, you can change your opener for flight A up until 3 minutes before the flight starts. For all other flights after flight A, up until the last three attempts of the flight before you. So that's like a hard deadline. Um,
This is when it's good to have a handler, especially
who
when you're
knows the
injured.
rules?
Yep. So that they can watch your warm ups and make those attempt changes for you.
Yeah, so making sure that you give yourself some time to do your last warm up and then go over to the scoring table and make that change. And this is another reason. So say you, for the example I'm using is you tweak your back on squat. Now you're at deadlift because apparently in my example, bench went fine with a tweaked back. um, and now you're on deadlift. Um, don't go and change your deadlift opener as soon as you know you don't feel good after squat. Wait until you're warming up for deadlift. And wait until you do your last warm up, which may well be different than what you planned for your last warm up,
Mhm.
to change your deadlift opener and save yourself time for that. Because again, you can only change your opener once and you put your openers in at weigh ins. So just if you know you need to change it, make sure you change it in time, but don't change it too early and then find out that you wanted to lower it more.
Don't forget to change it though. Okay. So sometimes when we're injured, we might skip an attempt or just take token lifts. Can you talk about skipping attempts, putting in a weight and timing out, or taking token lifts?
Yeah. So, sorry.
Okay.
Skipping attempts. Sometimes that's not a bad idea. If you're on deadlift and you're like, all right, I got my opener and I'm done. I don't feel okay. This isn't going to go any better than than it already is. I don't want to put myself through anymore. I have a total. I'm done. You have two options. One is you can put an attempt in. And when you put an attempt in, the bar will be called loaded for you, and you will have 1 minute to get for deadlift. You'll have 1 minute to start the lift. And when you do not come up there, they will then give you red lights for that lift, and they will load the bar for the next lifter. That is a kind thing to do to the other for the other people in your flight, especially if it's a smaller flight of lifters, because if you pass on your lift and put a 0 in, um, it shortens the time that they have between their attempts. There's another way we can address this, and I have I personally prefer that for my lifter or myself, because if we put a 0 in, yes, it's going to skip you altogether, and the other lifters in your flight are not going to get that, additional minute of rest when you
Mhm.
would be lifting. But the lifting database will more accurately reflect what happened.
Mhm.
Because if you just don't walk onto the platform for your, I don't know, 200 kilo deadlift, then the lifting database shows that you missed a 200 kilo deadlift in your meet history, even if you never even walked on the platform to do
Mhm.
it. But if you put a 0 in, it shows that you have a 0 and that obviously you passed on that attempt. So how you want your record in the database to show is something to consider. Um, and what was the other side of this that you asked me? Taking a token lift.
Mhm.
Yeah. So the other option is, say you just are not going to be able to deadlift anything even close to what you planned on, but you want to have a total. You have to have one good squat, bench, and deadlift in order to have a total for the meet. So you could put 70 kilos on the bar for deadlift, pull that, get white lights, and call it a day. And
Mhm.
now you have a total. Um, And you need a total in order to place,
Mhm.
if that's even in the cards anymore. So sometimes that makes sense to do. Now, if you can't even possibly bend over to put your hands on the bar, then maybe we have to
I
consider,
shouldn't laugh, but
yeah, maybe
not
you should
not
maybe
nice
you
of
should
me.
maybe you should go home.
Ah.
If you like it's just, you've got to just use your judgment and ask if it's worth it. And are you going to be crawling back to your car at the end of the day? Um, and it likely is going to be obvious to you if you should be going home or to a hospital. Uh, that's it probably won't be that hard to figure out. Like, can you do something? And it's just like if you were to tweak something in training. Sometimes we take a step back and we're like, okay, can I like really lower the weight
Mhm.
and squat the bar, or should I
Go
just,
home
yeah,
today.
is
Yeah.
today done?
Yeah.
um
Yeah. So listen, injuries happen. Like I said, it's not avoidable, um, or it's inevitable, but we can avoid them as best we can. But training for competition, especially the peak into competition, things can be a little fragile. And we should do what we can in training, manage our training stress appropriately to hopefully not get into a situation where these injuries or aches and pains or whatever are presenting themselves. But if they do, we really have to ask ourselves, how can I manage training leading into a competition to still do the meet if it's something that I really want to do or need to do? And really, I ha- I mean, I hate to say that we really don't need to do anything because powerlifting is not a profession. Um but if this is a qualifier and going in and doing like light weights that you can manage that won't really affect your injury are possible, then do that. Like, assess the goal of the meet, assess how you're feeling, assess if it's worth it, risk versus reward, like Alyssa was saying. But really, um we got once we're experiencing an injury leading into a competition, we need to then manage everything really um carefully to avoid making things worse, because the last thing you want to do is come out of the competition with the inability to keep making progress. um and even after the competition, we have to take some low stress weeks because we're in a fragile state after peaking for a competition. I have a client who came to me for a severe back injury. This is someone I hadn't been working with, but they had peaked for a competition, did the competition, and then decided that they wanted to test another lift the week after the competition, and ended up
I knew
really
that was coming.
effing up their back really bad. And this was like, they came to me because of this back injury. And I was like, oh, okay. Um, and it took a good year for that person to recover from that back injury. I mean, there's nothing that you can really do to speed that up. I mean, we continue to get stronger, managed the other lifts. Like every lift was affected by this. Your back's involved in all of your lifts. Um, so we had to change everything. Went from low bar to high bar. Think we did incline press for overhead press for a long time. We did rack pulls, feet up bench press, and we were able to train and we were able to progress those. And then we had to slowly move into the full range, full lifts that they were doing previously. But it took a while, and all because they were fine. Like they were fine. Had some hints of it. There's always hints. I want to say that there are usually always hints for like major competition injuries that happen within the competition. There's always hints leading into the competition. This person had like pretty gnarly glute tightness the weeks leading into that competition, and then tried to test another lift after the competition, and that glute tightness was probably referred back pain. Ended up hurting their back really bad. So don't go and try and PR after the competition. Don't try and go and like get a lift that you missed in the meet, that kind of thing. Like take your break, give your body rest, let it recover. You just spent a long time peaking for competition and hit PRs, hopefully. Um, just take a break, dude.
Yeah. And
um,
there's really no right answer on how to navigate going into it. Like when you have symptoms going into a meet, there's no right or wrong answer. And there's nothing wrong with simply saying, I don't feel like preparing for a meet while dancing around this issue. This is
Right.
not fun. Like,
Right.
that's the way I think. I'm like, this sucks now.
Right.
I'd rather not have the stress of getting ready for a meet if there's not a lot like that I'm giving up for that
Mhm.
meet. And I'd rather just deal with whatever's going on and
Mhm.
then train when I'm not. But of course,
Mhm.
stuff happens. So you have to gauge, well, how big of a dance around it are we
Mhm.
doing? um, but I don't think that there's one right answer. And it's really dependent on a lot of different variables.
Yeah. But ultimately, we should not get ourselves into this situation. So, in order to not get into the situation, I'm going to link our episodes on the sustainable training method, some articles on fatigue management, and our injury series. We have a 3-part injury series. So, hopefully your training leading into the competition doesn't lead to nagging issues or acute issues popping up. We also have our sustainable training builder, which is it's basically the program it's an Google spreadsheet um, program that we put together and use with all of our clients that helps us track training fatigue, response to training, and really manage to avoid injuries with our clients. So it's a free sustainable training builder, and basically it's like a 4-week spreadsheet, and you can duplicate it over and over and over and over again to rate your training and manage your training stress. So I'll link that in the show notes as well. And if you have any questions about injuries or competition or training, we're here for you. You can connect with us on Facebook in the Secret Society of Barbell Mastery. It's our free Facebook group. We do form checks, we answer questions, we do Q&A sessions. You can pop in there and start a discussion thread on anything in this podcast or any of our other podcasts that you're listening to. And you can connect with us on Facebook. I'm Rory Megan _ PRS, Rory with an I, Megan without an H. And then Alyssa is Alyssa Hope _ PRS, and it's Alyssa with a Y and 2 S's. Apparently, that's my new spiel this season on the podcast.
Oh boy.
But anyway, all those things that I talked about are linked in the show notes to this episode. Download that sustainable training builder because it will really help you see when you're at risk for things popping up. And you can change your training to reduce that stress so that you stay injury free. With all that said, we will see you on the next episode. Bye for now, guys.